Some gifts are blessings, others are curses disguised as miracles. Alara had learned the difference at 6 years old. The day the fever took her mother. The day the pack elders called her unnatural. The day she whispered to the shadows and the forest fell silent in terror. The power didn't arrive with a golden light or a choir of angels. It arrived with a scream. When the village men came to drive the witch child into the snow, the very trees seemed to lean in, shielding her path. She hadn't asked for the ability to mend shattered bone with a touch or to hear the heartbeat of a bird a mile away. She had only asked for a mother who stayed. By the time she reached the abandoned stone hut at the edge of the frost reach, the gift had become her cage. Rejection is a cold bedfellow, but silence is a loyal one. For 12 years, Alara told herself that the wind was better company than a dishonest pack. She told herself that being forgotten was the same thing as being free. She was lying. She spent her days gathering herbs and her nights listening to the mountain breathe, convinced she was the only soul the world had truly discarded. Her hands, capable of knitting life back into the dying, grew calloused from chopping wood for a fire that only she would sit by. She was the rejected Omega, a girl with a crown of thorns who had learned to love the sting. Until the night the scratching began. Not the scratching of a single predator, but the desperate, rhythmic clawing of dozens. When she pulled back the heavy oak bolt, she didn't find the monsters the villagers feared. She found 27 wolves, their fur matted with ice, their breathing ragged and shallow in the sub-zero air. They weren't there to hunt. They were there to survive. And they had chosen the door of the one person the world had told to stay hidden. 12 years is a long time to practice being invisible. In the high, jagged reaches of the frost reach, where the air is thin enough to cut and the snow never truly melts, Alara had built a life out of fragments and silence. The stone hut she called home was an architectural scar on the mountainside, forgotten by the pack that had exiled her, and ignored by the traders who feared the Witch of the Peak. Her fortress wasn't made of high walls or iron gates. It was made of routine. Every morning, she woke before the sun to the sound of her own heartbeat, the only rhythm she could trust. She would move through the small, dim room, her breath blooming in white clouds as she kindled a fire from cedar and dried moss. She didn't need a mirror. She had no one to be beautiful for. Instead, she watched her hands, the hands that had once been called unnatural, as they ground herbs into pastes and stitched together rabbit fur blankets. She had made a peace treaty with her loneliness, though it was a fragile one. "It's better this way," she would whisper to the hearth, her voice raspy from disuse. "No one to disappoint. No one to call me a monster when the shadows move at my command." This was the lie she fed herself every night, a bitter tea she drank to keep the ache in her chest from blooming into a scream. She told herself she was free because no one held her leash, ignoring the fact that she was also a ghost whom no one would mourn. The animals of the high wood were her only witnesses. A one-eyed hawk often perched on her roof, and the mountain hares would sometimes sit near her door, sensing the strange, humming warmth that radiated from her skin, a gift she had suppressed until it felt like a bruise. She was the rejected Omega, the girl whose very existence was an error in the pack's lineage. Yet here, among the stones and the ice, she was the only thing that felt real. She spent her afternoons trekking through the dead zone, a stretch of forest where the wind howled like a dying wolf. There, she gathered the rare frost lichen that only grew in the harshest conditions. It was a metaphor she didn't care to acknowledge, something beautiful and resilient thriving where everything else perished. She was a master of her craft, her movements efficient and graceful, born of a decade of surviving on the edge of the world. If a branch snapped a mile away, she heard it. If the pressure in the air shifted before a storm, she felt it in her marrow. But the more she mastered the mountain, the more the mountain reminded her of what she lacked. On the coldest nights, when the timber of the hut groaned under the weight of the snow, she would find herself staring at the empty chair across from her. She would imagine a life where her power wasn't a curse, where her gift was something to be celebrated rather than hidden behind heavy oak doors. She had created a sanctuary for herself, but it was a sanctuary of one. She was safe, yes. She was fed, yes. But she was a queen of a kingdom of dust and echoes. She had convinced herself that the world didn't want her, so she had decided she didn't want the world. The isolation was her armor. It was thick, it was cold, and it was starting to feel heavy enough to bury her alive. She had lived in this self-imposed exile for over 4,000 days, waiting for a life that she was certain would never come for her. She had no idea that the mountain was about to answer her silence with a roar. The storm did not arrive with a warning. It arrived with a vengeance. By midnight, the wind was no longer a howl. It was a physical weight, slamming against the stone walls of Alara's hut until the mortar groaned. Inside, the fire was a dying orange eye, casting long, shivering shadows across the herbs hanging from the rafters. Alara sat by the hearth, her fingers wrapped around a mug of bitter tea, listening to the mountain scream. Then, beneath the roar of the gale, came a sound that didn't belong to the wind. Scratch, scratch, whimper. It was low, rhythmic, and desperate. Alara froze. In 12 years, nothing had ever knocked on her door. The local villagers believed she was a plague. The mountain predators knew she was something they couldn't kill. But this sound wasn't a threat. It was a plea. She stood, her heart thundering a frantic percussion against her ribs. As she moved toward the heavy oak door, the scratching intensified, joined by a chorus of low, ragged huffs. She pulled back the iron bolt, the metal singing a cold, sharp note, and threw the door open against the force of the blizzard. The sight that met her eyes stole the breath from her lungs. 27 wolves lay huddled against her stone threshold. They weren't just cold, they were dying. Their fur was matted into jagged ice claws, their ribs protruded like skeletal fingers, and their breath came in shallow, rattling gasps that puffed white in the killing air. These weren't the lean, terrifying hunters of the low woods. These were the king's elite, massive, silver-furred beasts that usually commanded the mountain with a single look. Now they were broken. One wolf, larger than the rest, dragged its frost-bitten limbs across the floorboards, its golden eyes clouded with the haze of impending death. It didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It simply lowered its head and rested its wet, freezing muzzle against Alara's bare foot. The shock of the contact vibrated through her marrow. Through her gift, the curse she had spent a decade trying to drown, she felt the exact moment its heart began to stutter. She felt the icy grip of the frost reach tightening around 27 different lives. "Why here?" she whispered, her voice lost to the gale. The logic of the world said she should shut the door. She was the rejected Omega, the girl the Lycan Kingdom had spit out like a bitter seed. These were the creatures of the king who had sanctioned her exile. If she let them freeze, she would finally be even with the world that had forgotten her. But as the lead wolf let out a final, shuddering exhale, and its eyes began to roll back, Alara's hands moved before her mind could protest. "Inside," she commanded, her voice suddenly ringing with a power she hadn't used since she was 6 years old. "All of you, now." It was an impossible feat of physics. 27 massive predators, some weighing nearly 200 pounds, began to crawl, limp, and drag each other over her threshold. They filled her small sanctuary, a sea of silver fur and failing heat that pushed the walls of her isolation to the breaking point. The smell of wet fur and ozone filled the room, replacing the scent of dried lavender and loneliness. Alara slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. She looked at the carpet of dying animals covering her floor. She was one woman with a dwindling fire and a shelf of herbs, facing 27 deaths. To save, them would require her to pour every ounce of her cursed life force into their veins. It would leave her hollow, vulnerable, and exposed. If she succeeded, she would be saving the very army that kept her in exile. If she failed, she would spend the rest of her life in a house of ghosts. She knelt beside the lead wolf, her hands beginning to glow with a faint, terrifying emerald light. She had spent 12 years telling herself she was better off alone. She had no idea that by opening her door to the dying, she had just declared war on the king's peace. The small stone hut, once a vacuum of silence, was now a chorus of dying gasps. 27 massive bodies covered every inch of her floor, their silver fur clotted with ice that refused to melt in the meager heat of her hearth. Alara didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. She knew that in the economy of the mountain, every second she spent doubting was a second of life stolen from the creatures at her feet. She moved with a clinical, desperate grace. This was the curse in action. The power that had made her an outcast was now the only thing standing between these wolves and the void. She stripped her bed of its heavy furs, tearing them into strips to swaddle the smallest of the pack. She moved to her shelves, her hands flying through jars of dried root and preserved oils, mixing a concoction that smelled of earth and lightning. "Stay with me," she whispered, kneeling beside the lead wolf. His golden eyes were slivers of fatting light. She placed her palms against his matted chest. The gift that is a curse surged. Usually she kept the power coiled deep in her gut, a cold weight she tried to ignore. Now she let it unfurl. It felt like liquid fire pouring from her heart, through her arms and into the beast. She felt his heartbeat, a stuttering, frantic thing, and she forced her own steady rhythm onto it. She wasn't just healing, she was negotiating with death. For every degree of warmth she pushed into his frozen blood, she felt a corresponding chill settle into her own bones. Her breath began to hitch. Her fingers grew numb, but she didn't stop. She moved from one wolf to the next, a ghost in a room of monsters. She dragged heavy iron pots of water to the fire, infusing them with her essence before pressing the warm liquid to their muzzles. She mended shattered paws with a touch that left her vision swimming with black spots. "You're not dying tonight," she gritted out, her voice cracking as she moved to the 14th wolf. "Not in my house." The cost was physical. By the third hour, Alara's skin was as pale as the snow outside. Her muscles screamed with the effort of channeling so much raw vitality. This was the cost of power, the grounding reality that magic isn't free. To save 27 lives, she was effectively spending her own. She felt the grief of the mountain, the collective memory of every creature that had succumbed to the frost reach, and she pushed back against it with a stubbornness that only a rejected Omega could possess. She learned their names through the psychic hum of her gift. There was Swift, whose lungs were filled with fluid, Ironjaw, whose leg was snapped in 3 places, and the smallest one, a yearling she called Pip, who had nearly stopped breathing entirely. She spoke to them. She told them stories of the mountain, of the hidden valleys where the sun hit the grass just right, of the life they would have once the sun rose. The wolves, instinctual and honest, didn't see an Omega or a witch. They saw a savior. As she worked, those who regained consciousness didn't snap or snarl. They watched her with a reverence that was more profound than any courtly bow. They leaned their heavy heads against her knees, offering what little warmth they had left to the girl who was giving them everything. By the 4th hour, the air in the hut had changed. The scent of death had been replaced by the musk of living, breathing predators and the sharp, clean smell of healing magic. Alara was crawling now, her legs too weak to support her weight. She reached the last wolf, a massive female with a deep gash across her flank, and laid her forehead against the animal's neck. "Last one," Alara whispered, the words barely a shadow of sound. She poured the final dregs of her strength into the wound. She felt the skin knit together, the blood stop its frantic escape, and the wolf's breathing stabilize into a deep, healthy sleep. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in her shutters, Alara collapsed against the lead wolf's flank. She was hollowed out, her internal fire reduced to a pile of ash. She had saved them all. 27 blessings that the world would have called curses were now sleeping peacefully on her floor. She had spent 12 years in self-imposed isolation, convincing herself she needed nothing. But as Pip, the yearling, nuzzled into the crook of her arm, Alara felt a different kind of warmth, one that no hearth fire could provide. She had found a tribe in the wreckage of a storm. She closed her eyes for just a second, listening to the symphony of 27 heartbeats beating in time with her own. She had no idea that while she was nursing his pack, the Lycan King was scouring the mountainside in a blind rage. She had saved his army. Now she would have to face the man who led it. The transition from the deep, healing silence of the night to the thunder of the morning was instantaneous. Alara awoke not to the sun, but to the sudden, synchronized tension of 27 bodies. The lead wolf, the one she had breathed life back into just hours before, was already on his feet. He didn't growl at her. Instead, he placed himself between her sleeping form and the door, his hackles rising like a silver ridge. Outside, the world was no longer screaming with wind. It was vibrating with the heavy, rhythmic beat of hooves and the metallic clatter of plate armor. Alara dragged herself upright, her limbs feeling like lead weights. The cost of power was a physical debt she was still paying. Her vision swam, and her skin felt paper-thin. She reached for the wooden bolt, her fingers trembling. As she pulled it back, the door didn't just open. It was nearly taken off its hinges by the sheer presence of what stood on the other side. The frost reach was no longer empty. A literal army had stopped outside her door. Rank upon rank of Lycan warriors, mounted on massive, barrel-chested warhorses, formed a black and silver crescent around her humble stone hut. Their armor was frosted with the remnants of the storm, and their eyes, all varying shades of predatory amber, were fixed on the small, pale woman standing in the threshold. The scale jump was addictive to the brain, moving from the intimacy of a sick room to the grandeur of a kingdom-level response in a single heartbeat. At the center of the formation sat a man who didn't just command the space, he owned the mountain. He was towering, his shoulders broad enough to block out the morning sun, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight of authority. This was the Lycan King, the high-power entity who had governed her exile from a distance for 12 years. His golden eyes found her, and for a moment the air between them seemed to ionize. He looked at her tattered dress, her herb-stained hands, and the exhaustion etched into her face. Then he looked past her. The 27 wolves she had saved didn't cower. They didn't run to him. Instead, they formed a protective phalanx around Alara. The king's own elite guard, his pack covered her house, but their loyalty had shifted in the dark. The lead wolf let out a low, vibrating chuff, a clear signal of territorial protection. The king's expression shifted from icy command to profound, destabilized shock. In his centuries of life, he had never seen his creatures choose a stranger over their alpha. It was the ultimate, chosen one proof moment. The animals, acting as a moral mirror, had delivered a verdict the king couldn't ignore. "You," the king said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Alara's chest. "You are the one who kept them from the frost." Alara didn't flinch. She didn't bow. The power imbalance had inverted. She was the weakest by rank, yet she was the one who held the lives of his finest warriors in her hands. "They were dying," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "The mountain doesn't care about kings, and neither do I. I saw a need, and I filled it." The king dismounted, his heavy boots crunching into the frozen snow. He moved toward her, his movements predatory yet cautious. For the first time in 400 years, he wasn't looking at a subject, he was looking at a miracle. He saw her competence, not her beauty, and it was that capability that began to bridge the gap of his ancient loneliness. He stopped just inches from her, his massive shadow swallowing her whole. The tension was a living thing, a curiosity gap that forced the brain to want to know what happened next. "They call you the rejected Omega," he murmured. His eyes, searching hers for the source of the emerald light, he could still see dancing in her pupils. "I am whatever the world needs me to be," Alara replied, her chin lifting. The king looked at the 27 wolves, then back to the girl who had nearly died to save them. The morning light hit the scene, a tiny stone hut, a massive army, and a woman who had just accidentally changed the fate of a kingdom. The revelation was complete. The curse was actually a crown, and the exile was over. But as Alara looked into the king's eyes, she saw more than just a ruler. She saw a man who was as isolated by his power as she had been by her lack of it. The mountain was silent, waiting for the first word of a new era. The Lycan King, Fenris, stepped across the threshold of the stone hut, his massive frame nearly blocking out the morning sun. The air inside, still thick with the scent of pine, wet fur, and the lingering ozone of Alara's magic, seemed to vibrate under the weight of his presence. Behind him, his army remained a silent, frozen sea of steel and fur, but inside this small, cramped space, the power dynamic was shifting. Fenris did not look at the girl with the pity one might offer a rejected Omega. He looked at her with the sharp, narrowed focus of a predator who had found something he could not categorize. His golden eyes, ancient and heavy with the burden of centuries without true connection, scanned the room. He saw the empty herb jars, the blood-stained floor, and the 27 elite wolves of his personal guard, creatures that had been bred for war and bound to his will by blood, now curled protectively around a woman they had known for less than a day. "You are cold," Fenris remarked, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that felt like a physical touch against Alara's skin. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of the way her hands shook as she gripped the edge of her wooden table for support. "I am tired," Alara corrected him, her voice raspy but devoid of the submission he was used to from her rank. She didn't look down. She didn't offer the bended knee. Instead, she met his gaze with a defiance that unsettled him. "There is a difference." Fenris reached out, his large, calloused hand moving toward her face, not to strike, but to brush away a stray lock of hair matted with dried blood. Before he could touch her, a low, warning growl erupted from the shadows near the hearth. Pip, the yearling she had saved from the brink of death, bared his teeth at his own king. The lead wolf, the massive silver male she had breathed life into, rose to his feet, placing his heavy shoulder against Alara's hip, claiming her. The king froze, his hand hovering in the air. The shock on his face was a jagged thing. These animals were his army, his pack, his force. Yet they were choosing this isolated girl over the most powerful being in the world. This was the chosen one proof moment, the objective validation that Alara's worth was written in the laws of nature, not the politics of men. "They choose you," Fenris whispered, his voice stripped of its royal projection. He looked at the wolves, then back to Alara, seeing the faint green light still flickering in her exhausted eyes. "Even I cannot command them to move from your side." "They don't follow commands anymore," Alara said, her hand resting on the lead wolf's head, her fingers disappearing into the thick fur. "They follow the one who stayed awake when they were screaming in the dark." The clash was not one of swords, but of ideologies. Fenris represented the world that had cast her out, a world of hierarchy, rank, and the cold calculation of survival. Alara represented the gift that is a curse, the raw, unpolished power of empathy and selfless kindness that the Lycan kingdom had forgotten was its greatest strength. Fenris felt the destabilization. He had spent 400 years being feared, obeyed, and worshipped, but he had never been truly seen. In the eyes of this rejected Omega, he didn't see a king. He saw a man who had lost his way in his own mountain. The power imbalance had inverted completely. He was the one seeking entrance into her world. "Why did you do it?" he asked, stepping closer until the heat from his body began to fight the chill in her bones. "You owe this kingdom nothing. You owe me less than nothing." "I didn't do it for the kingdom," Alara replied, her voice dropping to a whisper as the lead wolf leaned his weight into her, supporting her failing strength. "I did it because they were dying. That's reason enough." The king fell silent, the universal truth of her statement echoing in the small room. He watched her, not the curve of her jaw or the color of her eyes, but the way she carried the weight of her exhaustion with the dignity of a fallen queen. This was competence as attractiveness in its purest form. He wasn't falling for a face. He was falling for the soul that had wrestled 27 lives away from the frost. "You are coming with us," Fenris stated, though it sounded less like an order and more like a plea for her to not leave him in his own loneliness. Alara looked at the army outside her door, then at the wolves at her feet. She felt the implicit danger of the world she had left behind, but she also felt the found family she had built in the wreckage of the storm. "I will go," she said, her voice strengthening as she met his golden gaze one last time. "But not as a prisoner, and not as your subject." The king bowed his head, a gesture of respect that rippled through the army outside like a shockwave. The first contact was over, but the war for her heart and the future of the kingdom had just begun. The air in the small stone hut remained thick, vibrating with the residual hum of Alara's magic and the heavy, predatory scent of the Lycan King. Outside, the army waited in a silence so absolute it felt like the mountain itself had held its breath. Fenris stood at the center of her world, a high-power entity whose shadow swallowed the very hearth she had spent 12 years tending alone. "You have spent 12 years in this frost, Alara," Fenris said, his voice dropping the royal projection for a tone of raw, ancient lonely king curiosity. "The pack calls you a ghost. The villagers call you a curse. But my wolves, they call you home." He stepped closer, the power imbalance between them shifting as he looked not at her status, but at her competence. He saw the way she stood, exhausted, pale yet unyielding, and it destabilized him more than any battlefield challenge. This was the mutual rescue framing. She had saved his elite guard from the frost, and now he was offering to save her from the fortress of isolation. "I am not offering you a cell in the castle, nor am I offering you a place in the servants' quarters," Fenris continued, his golden eyes locked on hers. "I am offering you a sanctuary, for you and for them." Alara looked at the 27 wolves. They were no longer just animals. They were her found family, the individuals she had fought death to keep. She saw Pip nuzzling her hand, and the lead silver wolf watching Fenris with a gaze that said they would not move unless she did. This was her agency moment. "If I go," Alara said, her voice steady despite the cost of power still racking her nerves with tremors, "I go on my own terms. I am not a prize to be displayed. I am not a tool for your wars. I am the caretaker of those the world discards." The king did not flinch at her defiance. Instead, he felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in centuries, respect for an equal. "Your terms are accepted. You shall have the North Wing. It shall be a place where no one enters without your leave, not even me." This was the threshold crossing. Alara turned back to her small hut one last time. She looked at the shelf of herbs, the narrow bed, and the heavy oak door that had been her only shield against a rejected-to-belonging ark. She realized she wasn't leaving her home. She was finally leaving her cage. As she stepped out of the hut, the scale escalation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Hundreds of Lycan warriors sat atop their massive steeds, their force creating a wall of steel. As she emerged, led by the 27 silver wolves she had healed, a ripple went through the ranks. They didn't see an Omega. They saw the woman who had done the impossible. Fenris offered his hand to help her onto a massive, black-clad charger. Alara ignored the hand, finding her own footing and mounting with a competence that silenced the whispers of the guard. She sat tall, the lead wolf trotting at her horse's flank, a moral mirror that told the entire army she was worthy. "To the citadel," Fenris commanded, his voice a visual shout that echoed off the peaks. The journey down the mountain was a time-jump compression. The miles of treacherous ice that had kept her exiled for a decade were swallowed in hours of rhythmic hoofbeats. Alara watched the weather as an emotional mirror shift. The biting blizzard of the night gave way to a cold, clear dawn, mirroring the clarity of her new path. As the high, obsidian gates of the Lycan citadel loomed before them, Alara felt the implicit danger of the court she was about to enter. She knew there would be antagonists, those like Lady Viven or Lord Calder who would see her as an ignorant rogue. But as she glanced at the 27 wolves surrounding her, and then at the king who watched her with a mutual rescue gaze, she knew she wasn't the girl who had been driven into the snow 12 years ago. She was the woman who had looked into the eyes of the king's army and told them to live. The gates swung open with a groan of ancient iron. Alara took a breath, the curse in her veins feeling more like a blessing than it ever had before. She crossed the threshold, not as a victim being rescued, but as a power being integrated. The isolation was over. The trial of the court was about to begin. The citadel was not the sanctuary Alara had imagined. It was a labyrinth of cold stone and even colder stairs. While the 27 wolves she had saved remained a silver shadow at her side, a found family that refused to leave her, the human elements of the court were less welcoming. Alara had been granted the North Wing as promised, but the walls of the castle felt thinner than the stone of her mountain hut, pierced constantly by the whispers of those who saw her only as a rejected Omega. This was the integration phase, where the power imbalance of the court sought to crush the girl who had unsettled their king. The first trial came in the form of Lady Viven, a high-ranking courtier whose ambition was as sharp as the diamonds at her throat. Viven represented the female antagonist who underestimated Alara's competence, viewing her as a primitive witch child who had used trickery to beguile the king's guard. A girl from the frost playing at being a healer, Viven sneered during a formal gathering in the Great Hall, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Tell us, Omega, did you use charms to make the animals forget their true master, or was it merely the smell of the gutter that drew them to you?" Alara did not flinch. Her years of isolation had given her a skin thicker than any courtier's silk. She looked at Viven, then at the lead silver wolf sitting regally at her heel, a moral mirror that Viven could not manipulate. "I used no charms, my lady," Alara replied, her voice calm and devoid of the status anxiety Viven expected. "I used the same thing you seem to lack, a willingness to bleed so that others might breathe. The wolves do not care for your titles. They care for the hand that mends the bone." The public reversal was instantaneous. The king, watching from his throne, felt a surge of competence as attractiveness, as he saw Alara dismantle the court's hierarchy with nothing but the truth of her work. The surrounding guards, many of whom were kin to the 27 wolves she had saved, shifted their weight, their respect for Alara deepening while their regard for Viven withered. However, a darker threat lurked in the form of Lord Calder, a male antagonist with designs on the throne. Calder was a power threat who saw Alara's gift not as a miracle, but as a political obstacle. He began to plot in the shadows, spreading rumors that Alara's presence was a curse that would draw the king's enemies to their gates. "She is a liability," Calder whispered in the war rooms, his eyes gleaming with ambitious intent. "The king is blinded by his ancient loneliness. He brings a rogue into our heart and calls it a blessing. If she stays, the border raids will only worsen. She is the bait, and we are the trap." The trials grew more physical as the days passed. Alara was called to the infirmary to treat warriors wounded in skirmishes she suspected Calder had orchestrated. She worked until her gift left her trembling, her cost of power manifesting in dark circles under her eyes and a constant, bone-deep chill. Each time she successfully healed a dying soldier, the underestimation setup was further dismantled, and the mutual rescue bond between her and the king grew stronger. Fenris often visited her in the North Wing during the intimate scene exhale moments between tensions. They would sit by a fire that actually felt warm, the 27 wolves acting as a bridge between their worlds. "You are working yourself to death for a people who once cast you out," Fenris said one evening, his large hand hovering near hers but not yet touching, a power imbalance of a different kind. "I am working for the people, Fenris," she said, using his name for the first time, an agency moment that made the king's heart stutter. "The throne is yours, the lives are mine." This was the integration. Alara was no longer just a guest. She was becoming the moral compass of the Citadel. But the conspiracy was reaching its boiling point. Calder's plot to expose her hidden power as a danger to the kingdom was nearly ready, and the implicit danger she had felt since arriving was about to manifest in a way that would test the cost of power to its absolute limit. The weather as an emotional mirror began to turn. The clear skies over the Citadel were being swallowed by a gathering, unnatural storm. Alara felt it in her marrow. The inciting event was merely the beginning. The real battle for her earned crown was coming, and it would require a sacrifice she wasn't sure she could pay. The unnatural storm Alara had sensed finally broke over the Citadel, but it didn't bring snow. It brought shadows. Lord Calder's conspiracy reached its lethal crescendo under the cover of a sky that bled a sickly, bruised purple. He had bypassed the outer wards, using a corrupted relic to dampen the king's sensory link to his warriors. The implicit danger was no longer a whisper. It was a blade at the throat of the kingdom. "They are inside the south wall." A scout's voice cut through the thunder, followed by the jagged scream of iron meeting iron. Fenris was a blur of silver-black fur and fury, his high-power form a visual shout of dominance as he tore through the first wave of Calder's mercenaries. But the trap was layered. Calder hadn't brought men to fight a king. He had brought a nullifier, a weapon designed to turn a Lycan's own strength against them. As Fenris leaped to intercept Calder in the courtyard, a pulse of gray light erupted from the traitor's hands. The king collapsed, his transformation stuttering, his massive frame hitting the flagstones with a sound that made the earth shudder. "The king is down," Calder's voice rang out, triumphant and cold. "See how your god falls like any other beast." Alara watched from the balcony of the north wing, her breath hitching. The 27 wolves around her let out a collective, mournful howl that vibrated in her very marrow. This was the scale escalation, the moment where the rejected Omega had to decide if she was a guest or a guardian. "Stay," she commanded the wolves, her voice a sharp, silver needle in the chaos. She didn't run to the armory. She didn't look for a sword. She stepped into the rain, her competence manifesting as a calm that terrified the mercenaries who tried to block her path. With a flick of her wrist, the shadows of the castle walls seemed to lengthen, tripping her attackers. She moved through the battlefield like a ghost, her hands already glowing with the emerald light of the gift that is a curse. She reached Fenris just as Calder raised a blackened silver blade over the king's throat. "Step away from him," Alara said. She didn't scream, she didn't plead. She made a statement of fact. Calder laughed, a sound of underestimation that would be his undoing. "And what will the little herb gatherer do? Patch his skin while I take his head." "I won't patch him," Alara whispered, her eyes turning a solid, burning green. "I will be him." She knelt and placed her hands on Fenris's back. The cost of power was instantaneous and agonizing. She wasn't just healing a wound. She was absorbing the nullifier's poison into her own body to act as a bridge. Her skin began to crack, glowing lines of energy tracing her veins. She felt the king's heartbeat, slow, heavy, and dying, and she gave him her own. The mutual rescue reached its peak. Through the contact, Fenris felt her life force pouring into him, not as a submissive offering, but as a command to rise. He felt her memories of the 12 years in the frost, her resilience and her selfless kindness. It acted as a catalyst, shattering the nullifier. Hold. Fenris roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the citadel. He surged upward. His strength tripled by Alara's magic. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Calder and pinned him to the stones, the traitor's life now a flickering candle in the king's grip. But as the battle ended and the mercenaries fled into the night, the fast-to-slow packing shift occurred. The visual shout of the fight died away, replaced by a terrifying silence. Fenris turned, his golden eyes searching for the woman who had saved him. He found her slumped against a stone pillar, her breathing shallow, her skin as gray as the morning ash. The emerald glow was gone, replaced by a darkness that seemed to be drinking her light. "Alara," Fenris shifted back to his human form, his size making him look like a mountain leaning over a broken flower. He reached for her, his hands trembling, a power imbalance where the king was now the one who was helpless. "The cost," she whispered, her eyes struggling to focus on his face. "The mountain always takes its due." She fell forward into his arms. The weight of power had finally crushed her. The 27 wolves gathered in a circle around them, their heads lowered in a silent vigil of grief. The weather as an emotional mirror followed suit. The purple lightning vanished, replaced by a slow, rhythmic rain that felt like the world was weeping. Fenris held her against his chest, his ancient loneliness returning with a 1,000-fold intensity. He had finally found the one soul who could stand beside him, and he had let her spend herself to save a crown he no longer wanted. "Don't go," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "I have spent 400 years waiting for you. Do not leave me in the dark again." The great hall was silent. The battle was won, but the victory felt like ashes. The king sat in the rain, a god mourning a mortal, realizing that the weight of power was nothing compared to the weight of a heart that was no longer beating. The rain did not stop, but it changed. The violent downpour of the battle transitioned into a soft, rhythmic mist that settled over the citadel like a shroud of silver. Inside the great hall, the silence was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic breathing of 27 wolves. They had not moved from the circle they formed around the king and the girl who had given everything to save him. Fenris did not look at his generals. He did not look at the cowering remnants of Calder's faction. He looked only at Alara's face, pale, still, and etched with the cost of power. "You said the mountain takes its due," Fenris whispered, his voice a raw, emotional saturation rasp. "But you are the mountain, Alara. You are the heartbeat of this land. It cannot take what it already is." He placed his hand over her heart. It was silent. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 400 years, the high-power entity reached out not with a command, but with a plea. He didn't use his rank. He used the mutual rescue bond she had forged in the frost. He pushed his own ancient vitality into her, revering the flow she had started. A minute passed, then two. A small, jagged gasp broke the silence. Ilara's chest rose, a shallow, desperate movement that was the most beautiful sound Fenris had ever heard. Her eyes flickered open, not burning with green fire, but clear and human. "The wolves," she whispered, her voice barely a shadow. "They are here," Fenris replied, his hand tightening slightly on hers. "They are yours, and I am yours." The transformation was not just hers, it was the kingdom's. The weather as an emotional mirror finally cleared, the clouds parting to reveal a sun so bright it turned the wet stones of the citadel into gold. Ilara was helped to her feet, not as a rejected Omega, but as the earned crown of the Lycan pack. The generals bowed. The warriors clattered their spears in a visual shout of respect. The girl who had been driven into the snow 12 years ago was now the one who held the keys to their survival. She didn't need a title. Her competence was her sovereignty. Fenris stood beside her, his size no longer a threat, but a shield. He looked out over his people, then back at the woman who had mended his soul. The ancient loneliness was gone, replaced by a found family that started with 27 wolves and ended with a king who had finally learned to follow. "Where do we go now?" Fenris asked, the question itself a final agency moment for Ilara. Ilara looked at the gates, then at the mountain peaks she had once called her only friends. "We go where we are needed," she said, her hand finding his. "There are more than 27 souls out there waiting for a door to open." The resolution was complete. The rejected had become the redeemer, and the king had become a partner. They walked together toward the sun, followed by a silver pack that would never leave their side again. Sometimes opening your door in the dead of night changes the fate of a kingdom forever. Subscribe for more Lycan romances, where the smallest act of kindness commands the greatest power. Remember, the world may reject your gift, but the right pack will always recognize your worth.